Annoyed, angry, frustrated, sad, fed up, confused, depressed. No, that doesn't describe my relationship with Johnny Hunt, because obviously we're the Ant and Dec of the 1871 podcast. I don't know who's Ant, who's Dec. It's fair to say we're taller than them. But that's the way I think that majority, if not all, Reading fans are feeling at the moment. We are annoyed, we are angry, we're frustrated, fed up, sad, confused. We don't know what's going on. Very depressing. And we've had a massive setback this week. We all thought, we've got a track record of this. We think something's going to happen. We even go to the point of announcing it sometimes. That's another story for another day. But no, it's just awful news. And we've got some theories. But so welcome everyone to this special, what we're calling the WTF is going on at Reading FC episode of the 1871 podcast. And I'd like to start by sending a message to our current owner, still our current owner. So here goes. Mr. Dai, we know that your name says that you own Reading Football Club, but I would like to remind you that this club actually belongs to us, the fans. So can you give it back to us? In the words of Casey and the Sunshine Band, give it up. And in the words of Anne Robinson, Mr. Dai, you are the weakest link. Goodbye. Well, that's what we want to happen as Reading fans. And look, in all seriousness, we do know that this is not a straightforward process. And there's plenty of people with theories of what might have happened. But we are going to at least try to make some sense out of it. I'm not sure we're going to succeed in doing that. But we'll try, even though at the moment it does feel a bit like we're losing 9-2 against Bayern Munich. Anyway, so firstly, hello to my co-host Johnny, aka Ant or Dec.
Good afternoon. How are we?
I'm good. I'm good despite everything.
Absolutely.
And we've got not one, but two fantastic guests for you on this episode, talking about WTF is going on at Reading FC. So later on, we'll be joined by Mr. BBC Radio Berkshire, certainly on the sports side of things, Tim Dellor. So he's joining us in about 20 minutes or so. Looking forward to chatting to Tim. But before we speak to Tim, I'm really delighted to say that we've got a new member of Star Supporters Trust at Reading on the board there, who's joining us. And he's also part of the Sell Before We Die campaign. So really delighted to welcome Greg Double. Greg, thanks ever so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, March. I will be the Stephen Mulhern to your Ant and Dec.
Yeah, that's fair enough. That's fair enough. Unbelievable is unbelievable. It's the right word, isn't it? So, look, I'm gonna start off with the theme of this, with that question. WTF is going on? Over to you, Greg, to try and make some sort of sense of it. So, you've come in as a new board member at Star. You're obviously a Reading fan. Just from a Reading fan perspective, from everything that you've heard, some of it rumours, some of it probably true, some of it might be true. We don't really know. What's your take on what's going on, really?
Yeah, no, I think it's a really good question. I think, look, I'm going to focus on, and this is something we've learned from both Sell Before We Die and more recently Star, is that we're much better when we act on what we know rather than what is speculated and various rumours coming in. So we know that Rob Cohig is out. It's really sad, and I think that the vast majority of fans were keen to have him come over. But we know he's been paid back in full, which is curious but interesting. And we know that there is a promise to fund the club, which I think is, in terms of the things we know, is the single most important bit in the short.
So I'm really sorry to interrupt you, but that statement you've just made there, are you talking about you don't know where that's coming from, or are we talking about the Rob Couhig might still be helping out, or is that completely gone?
I think as I understand it, Rob Couhig is completely out for the time being and has been paid back in full. So that's him cleanly cut out, right? So look, we go by the club statement, right? And the reason I feel that, however uncaring and unemotional that statement was, there was one very, very, very important bit of information in there, which is the line funding the club until it is sold. Now, that is a bit of pill and scarcely believable for a lot of Reading fans when you know that we have 18 points worth of deductions for the exact opposite of that happening. However, the only bit of assurance I can give you on that is I know that statement would have been signed off by lawyers. Lawyers literally cannot lie about that, so there has to be some evidence for the club to be funded. Now, if the club is funded, that does mean that we're not going to get any points deductions from the EFL from that point of view. So HMRC will be paid, staff will be paid. That is, it's not radiantly brilliant news, but it's not bad news. Like, that is okay. So we've got time to buy on. As for why the deal collapsed, one thing I want to be really, really clear on, and I hope this is something the listeners pick up on, is there's sometimes an assumption that Sell Before We Die will start in the know. Absolutely. Like, I can't begin to tell you how much more in the know I would like to be.
Well, Greg, with that in mind, I've got a question to ask you, and if you have no idea, have a guess. You know, how grateful do we need to be at the moment to Michael Elise? Is that, how big a factor is that?
It's helped. Like, it's like things. So I can't say for certain, but that money is coming in and is coming in installments. And obviously, had he not been sold for a fantastic amount of money, we wouldn't have that money. And so it helps. The bit I think people need to understand, this doesn't mean that we are a club that is flush. It's like, let's assume that our wage bill is roughly £5 million. I think the first instalment of Elise, I've seen it reported as £3.5 million. So it's gone some way to paying off our wage bill for the year. But you know that's not how finances work, right? You don't just get a lump sum of £3.5 million and go, £3.5 million to the wages. That's got to be spread around the club. That's got to go. It hasn't hurt, and there is a part of me that thinks that might have not contributed to the deal's collapse, because deals collapse like this for a whole heap of reasons and for millions of myriads. But I think it might have given, and like, look, to be clear, I'm speculating here because I'm trying to get into a man's head I don't understand, but it might have given him a bit of breathing room and gone, like, actually, maybe I don't have to take this Couhig deal because the club's got an extension on its life support. Like, I think that's a logical theory to have. It could also be that he just didn't like the deal, and something went wrong at the deal that's not as spectacular and it's not as fundamental. But I'm speculating now, and I don't like to do that. As I said, like, I think we're better when what we know, and what we know is there has been a promise to fund the club, which means there's no points deduction coming from the EFL anytime soon, and there's no disciplinary action at the moment from the EFL, except for the overhanging punishment from the last fan intrusion, i.e., if we go on the pitch again, we're getting a points deduction.
Well, I just got one more thing to ask you. Probably by the end of the question, I'll think of something else. But anyway, I'll ask you a question. Then I'm going to hand over to Johnny, because I'm sure, Johnny, you got plenty of things you want to ask Greg. But we had a Derby fan got in touch. Derby fan listened to us, watched us on YouTube, got in touch. I mentioned the possibility of going into administration. I've remembered the second thing now. So I mentioned, you know, there's a possibility, it was mentioned before, we might go into administration. The Derby fan, they've been through what we're going through now. He said that's the best thing that can, I don't know, this is just what I'm, you know, relaying that message that this Derby fan sent us. He said, the best thing that can happen to Reading at the moment is go into administration, and then the control goes away from the current owner. What do you feel about that? And then I'll try and remember the second bit to the question.
Yeah. So it's something that Star have looked into and are increasingly educated about, is administration. Because look, it's entered all of our thoughts. Like, it's one way to go, fan. Also, if you speak to any Crystal Palace fans, they will say administration was the thing to go in. Where it's a little bit more complicated for Reading is because of the way that the club is structured in terms of who owns what. If we go into administration, there's still the risk that Dai Yong could be landlord of a stadium and could keep us out of that. Do you see what I mean? Like, so there's like anything. So in answer to the question, is it the best thing that could happen to us? I'm a Reading football fan. I don't want to be deducted 12 points. I would rather, if you gave me the option between Dai Yong funding us to the minimal degree, but with the view that he is genuinely trying to sell the club, which I'm going to ask people to suspend belief on, that maybe he genuinely is and he just didn't like the deal. I've got my own personal views on that, but we'll crack on. I would rather that than administration, because one of them results in the football team that I love not being done for 12 points, and one of them results in a business collapse that could come in. And my biggest fear, and again, this is a personal opinion with administration, is administration brings some really, really bad potential buyers into the table. There's someone who, the sort of, the Mike Ashleys of the world who'll have us for £1 and then look to
fire sale, it's called, I think, isn't it?
Exactly, right. So it's an option, and it's not one that we're completely terrified of. But look, I'm a football fan first and foremost, and I don't want to take. I'm getting a bit emotional just talking about it. I don't want to see this club lose any more points.
And going back to that point that you made, Greg, and I've still remembered the second bit of the question, but going back to that bit, the point that you made, like, what do you think? Do you believe that he genuinely, that statement that's come out, do you believe that he genuinely still, he wants to sell the club, he just wants the right deal? Is that that your gut feeling?
I'm prepared to take pelters for this, but I do, because I can't see the benefit of not. And so there is you've either got to genuinely believe he wants to sell, and that's the noises we've had off the club, that's the noises we've had off the EFL as well, which I think is worth highlighting, that there is a genuine belief that he wants to sell. The alternative view is you have to think, it's like, right, why wouldn't he not want to sell? And then you've either got to decide that he's evil and he just loves killing football clubs, or there is a reason that he can't sell. And I don't know. So all the rational arguments point towards he genuinely wants to sell. He's just taking his sweet time about it. As annoyingly as his prerogative, right? The alternative is something bonkers is happening, which I don't think we can ever rule out. But I don't know if there's something bonkers happening. Like, do you see what I mean? So there's a logical argument I'm comfortable with, and then there's an irrational argument that could also be true, but I'd rather play in the logical one.
Right, Johnny, I promise this is the very last thing I'm going to ask Greg, and then you take over. It's the Johnny show, the ant or deck bit after that. So, final question from me, Greg, before Johnny takes over. There's a couple of theories, and they might be connected. They might not be true. There might be something in it. We don't know. But there's a couple of theories. One is about the cultural differences of doing business. So in some cultures, in terms of doing business transactions, you agree a deal and you stick to the deal. That's kind of that's the way that we do it in the UK, generally speaking. But in other parts of the world, there's a kind of an accepted part of the culture where you do a deal and then you move the goalposts. You negotiate something, one person agrees it, and then when it comes to the other person wants to renegotiate. So that is slightly, in terms of a business context, there is a cultural thing about that. The other thing is that it goes back to what you said. He might just think, I think, maybe they agreed pretty much everything, T's and C's to be signed, and then he's gone, actually, I'm going to move the goalposts a bit. I think I can hold out for more money, or whatever it is. So that's me done. What are your thoughts?
I think you've presented both cases of what could possibly be happen, and I can't tell you for sure because I wasn't in the room, but I can see a world in which goalposts shifted a lot in this deal because of the money being used to front up the club, right? So I could see a world in which Rob Courig has said, like, look, I've covered the club for however long, knock that off the asking price, right? That wasn't what we agreed prior, but do that, which I don't imagine that would go in. Again, I'm speculating again, but I can also see a world where Dai at the last minute has gone, actually, I want a couple of extra mil. Like, do you know what I mean? It's like it could have happened. And the bit that I do think some fans need to understand is, like, deals do collapse at the 11th hour quite a lot. Like, it's just we don't care as much about them when they're not our football club. And to give you an example, like, look, Rob didn't. If I feel like it's a tough climate to be critical of Rob at the moment, but if Rob perhaps shouldn't have been parading around the stadium until the contract was signed, right? Like, and I think that elevated emotion to a point that when it did collapse, it hurts so much more. And I think that's a lot of it. And like Johnny will know from the fantastic mental health work he did, I think the extent of emotional feeling of, oh my God, I think this is over. And I think I can say, like, look, there was a point where we were like, there was the day where everyone was like, it's done. Everyone had felt it was done, and then it wasn't. So there was a genuine feeling there. But I'm just like, look, the only issue I have with Rob in this whole process was just wait till the ink's dry. And I think you've seen Ruben say it in his own interviews. That's the bit that's killed him, like, mentally, was he felt like it was there. And so I think you've got to try. It's so difficult because we're talking about football, not Tesco's being bought. Like, it was emotionally exhausting. But there are a million, for all the exciting conspiracy theories, there's a million boring reasons a deal can collapse. And that can be anything from the installments have changed, or actually we're not quite as liquid as we thought we were for the first installment. Can we pay more on the second installment? Like, these, I'm not saying this did happen, but there are a million legitimate reasons a deal can fall apart the 11th hour. So it's a long way of me saying, sorry, mate, I don't know. But yeah. I think I just want to implant the seed in people's heads that sometimes a deal can collapse for non-nefarious reasons. Otherwise, you're asking, the alternative is you are saying that Dai Yong is basically Heath Ledger's Joker, right? Some men just want to watch the world burn. Now, that might be the case, but that's the bonkers side of it. And it might be we're in a situation that is completely bonkers. I will always rather look at the rational side of it.
But well, I'm gonna hand over to Johnny now because we're fast running out of time with you, Greg. Sorry about that, Johnny. Mostly.
Hey.
I've, as you know, Johnny, I've compared it to something like trying to buy a house in a chain and someone in the chain pulled out. It might be something like that. But Johnny, look, I'm going to shut up now. Hand over to you.
No worries, Greg. First, it's great to have you on part of Star Board, mate, to have new voices and new ideas.
I thought it was going to be a nice, quiet retirement into Star because Sell Before We Die was about to close.
Yeah.
I've actually got a real taste. I was going to say, I've actually got a real taste for this fan engagement stuff. Now, I'd like to do it like in a nice, normal setting of Star rather than Sell Before We Die. And then it's like, oh, great, everything's like it was.
With that, Greg, like you were saying about Ruben Sellers yesterday, he got very emotional in his interview, and like he looks like he's had enough, and you wouldn't blame him for what he's been dealing with, and the players and the background staff. Looking at, with Sell Before We Die, and obviously Star being involved in that, and the campaign that you had and probably thought was kind of nearly over with a takeover happening. What do you do now? What's your kind of thoughts on where does Sell Before We Die go next? And obviously, I think, as we all know, keeping the protests off the pitch and away from the team is definite 100% not going to happen.
No, I think yesterday's press conference, less so with Nigel's disaster class in media relations, but like I find it really hard to be too harsh on Nigel because I'm like, look, he's also been at the club when Reading were very successful, and I think that should count for something. But I think to echo your point, I cannot see any world in which on the pitch helps or any in-pitch disruption helps, right? So I think we've ruled it out. I would say we've almost had a bit of a reset moment with Sell Before We Die of like, right, we actually need to take, again, boring thing to say, take the emotion out of it a little bit and really spend some time doing some fact finding, and just in terms of the deal and how we went through and what. For example, just this week we have spoken to, I think, 6 MPs, 2 experts in Chinese business culture, to tap into Mark's point, see if we can get a bit of insight on that. 6 MPs, 2 Chinese business experts. We've spoken to some fans with expert in mergers and acquisitions who've been able to educate us a little bit on the structure of the deal, which, happy to say, did play out. We've tried to speak to people a bit closer to the deal and third parties who have been into the deal. We've spoken to some other people who made bids into the deal with all the information. And like, we're currently at a point where we are really, really just trying to, like, because I think one thing I think the fan base will all agree on is if you spend too much time on Twitter and you get sucked up in all the in the know stuff, it's the perfect antidote to that is getting your facts right and lining up. And so I would say that we're currently in a bit of a fact finding point where we can actually start saying, like, look, is there any way we can influence, put a bit more pressure on the deal and come through? And like, look, a lot of suggestions have been like, my personal favorite is like, look, is there anything we can do to speak to Chinese government, Chinese officials, that famously open, famously open, easy to reach group? But we're not against that. But I'm not opening up a dialogue with Chinese government without intimate knowledge of the way to approach that in a way that is respectful, inoffensive, is going to get the best result, right? Which at one point I was quite up for marching on the Chinese embassy. I was told under no circumstances that would be completely the wrong thing to do. They would take it really badly. And it was just like, okay, so that's out. It might make us all feel a bit better, but that's out. And so I think we're in the fact finding bit. The bit for me where I think we are making some real progress now in line with Huddersfield, because it's a televised game, is we're looking towards something that is really visual and first and foremost puts a big cuddle around our manager and our team. Because
absolutely,
I have never, and I mean this like as a all-round football fan, I have never read or heard an interview like that from a manager at any level in any game. The emotional availability, honestly, like, it's like the guy's in bits. Like, and it's like, that was hard to listen to. Forget football for a minute. That was hard to listen to as a man, and being like, I'm hearing another man talk that emotionally and that destruction. It's like, John, you'll know this way better than anyone, but getting men to talk about their mental health, I thought it was genuinely inspiring. And more importantly than ever, he told us explicitly, nothing that disrupts these players, nothing that disrupts his team. I'm a Reading football fan. I'm going to do what our manager and players have asked us to do. And that is, it's going to be something visual, something positive. We're inviting all sorts of, and I've seen some cracking suggestions from the fan base on some really lovely stuff in that ilk. And I think that's the stuff that captures the mood of the fans. It's something that is really pro Ruben Sellers. And look, again, this is my personal opinion, but I think if you put together the time for on the pitch and the disruption, job done. I don't think there is a lack of awareness about our situation anymore. I think, like, no. You've got Simon Thomas, you've got Jeff Stelling, you see Henry Winter. These are some of the biggest, most influential names in football, are aware of Reading's plight. I also think that an extremely positive message comes out, also could send a message to some potential buyers and being like, look at this fan base.
Yeah.
They've disrupted pitches, they've got matches abandoned, they've been battered, and they are still packing out stadiums in League One, supporting their football team. I want a part of that because I can build that and I can take that to the Premier League in 2 seasons. So that's where we're heading, is a really positive point. But we're also trying to mitigate for what I'm calling the bonker section, right? So it's just sort of like, I can't believe any other version than he genuinely wants to sell. So we're going to act in that way. We are making mitigating plans for what I'm calling the bonker section of, if there is something absolutely nefarious going on, which we're also planning for. So it's tricky. But I think Ruben speaking to the press as he did yesterday gave us a real help in terms of the direction of travel that we think protests should take, and they are positive, not negative.
Greg, that's the thing. Fantastic for you to join us. Really appreciate your time representing both Start and, unfortunately, still, as you said, Sell Before We Die. You have to think of some new stuff to do now, won't you? Okay.
It's no, I'm so bored. I'm so bored of Sell Before We Die. Like, I really thought we were cooked, and it was just like, please, just off into the retire. You know what the worst thing?
Greg, I would love to invite you to stay and listen to. We've got our next guest now waiting in the wings. So if you want to have a listen to what Tim Dellor's got to say, you're welcome to stay with us. But thanks ever so much for your time.
35 years of my life listening to what Tim Dellor says, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. So I will, with respect to my employer, I better bounce. But
All right.
Tim, have a lovely chat with these lovely gentlemen.
Take care, Greg.
Look forward to hearing your dulcet tones on Saturday.
Thanks, Greg. And hello to our next guest, Tim Dellor from BBC Radio Berkshire, the voice of sport for BBC Radio Berkshire. How are you, Tim?
Yeah, good. How are you doing? All right.
Yeah, good. We're having an interesting discussion about. We're calling it WTF is going on at Reading FC, and I'm going to put that question to you, really, Tim. As you know, we all hear you talking on BBC Radio Berkshire in an official capacity, but of course, you're like the rest of us. You're a fan. So, how are you feeling as a Reading fan at the moment?
Quite tired, I think, probably in a word. And it's been a obviously pretty traumatic week for anybody who follows the club. From a media point of view this week, there have been demands and pulls all over the place because it has been a very busy week, which has gone way beyond Reading, actually, in terms of interest in what's happening. But yeah, it's exhausting, isn't it? And I think, well, just listening to Greg there and you guys, we've thought for so long now that surely this is coming to an end, this whole sorry saga. And every time you think you see a bit of light at the end of the tunnel, it gets closed off, and we're in for another, well, I would say at least 3 months of trauma and waiting and nerves and anxiety. So yeah, it's exhausting.
Well, Greg made a really good point. He said that obviously you've got your kind of, the Twitter sphere, X as it's called now, and that'll drive you nuts if you believe everything that you read on there, obviously. BBC, you have to be impartial and all that sort of thing. But you can tell, Tim, when you listen to you can tell you're a Reading fan and you've got passion, you care about this. And we talked about some of the theories, some of the ideas, what's gone wrong, what needs to happen, what can Sell Before We Die do? Will it make any difference? All of that stuff. It's really going to be a really difficult question to answer, but what do you think the next step is now? What do we are we powerless? Is it a case now of there's nothing we can do about this? We just have to have a even longer agonizing wait, or what are your thoughts about what should happen next, what might happen next?
Yeah, I mean, look, I don't think we should be defeatist. So I don't think we should say we're all powerless. And as fans, I hope that's the same attitude as well. There's no right or wrong answer to that question, is there? Part of me thinks we should all rally behind those people in positions of power who are trying to make things happen and trust them. And that's sort of my nature and inclination. But I absolutely get that there are other people whose nature and inclination is to be a bit more loud and vociferous, and will sort of head towards a bit more sort of active protesting. I do feel really strongly that anything that's disruptive and risks Reading being docked more points is very futile and very counterproductive. And I know that next week the club are going to be very busy trying to make absolutely sure that doesn't happen. I mean, Ruben Sellers, the poor guy yesterday, I don't know if you heard some of the interview I did with him yesterday. He was absolutely fuming and distraught and really worried about the possibility of the fans reacting in a negative way and leading to a points deduction. That just mustn't happen, because I think we're all fundamentally on Ruben's side, on the players' side, and if there is any sort of problem come the Huddersfield game, it's going to be very bad for the club. So we might have got away with it once earlier on this year, but I don't think that's the way forward.
Well, Greg made a really good point, and I'll hand over to you in a sec, Johnny. But Greg said that obviously the football world knows about Reading now. That part of that was to do with awareness, and you've got TalkSport's talking about it. Sky is talking about Reading, and it's around the world people are talking about Reading. And there's a bigger issue, isn't there? Like,
Yes.
it seems, for me, it seems to be, relatively speaking, straightforward that he was able to buy the club, and near on impossible to get him out. It should kind of be the other way round, really. But Tim, just tell us, before I hand over to Johnny, just talk about what you know in terms of where this deal got to, what, if you have an inkling for anything, and are we back to square one, or is it not quite that bad?
Well, let me start with the last bit there. So, in terms of being back to square one, not quite that bad, because there are two or three other potential buyers when Rob Coig was selected as the one to pursue. And so it's hoped that they'll return to the negotiating table and one of them will be selected. So it's not quite as bad as going back to square one. Also, the lawyers have done a lot of work. The due diligence has already been done. So there's a package there, all boxed up and ready to go for any potential owner. Here it is. Have a read through of that. That's what you're buying. On you go. Whereas with Rob Coig, he had to put all that together, and his lawyers and the club had to put all that due diligence together. So they've done all of the prelim work, and that could mean it'll be quicker through that section of the deal, of the negotiating. So that's a positive thing, definitely. Remind me what the first bit of the question was, because I was more interested in that. I liked that.
Yeah, so I just wondered if what you know about what happened,
Yeah.
if you had an inkling for anything.
Yeah, no, so look, I mean, I've heard the same interviews and done the interviews that people have heard, obviously, and it's a bit about who you trust. But I've heard from several different sources that it shouldn't all be laid at Dai Junger's door. Now, I know Reading fans are all itching to have a pop at him at every time there's an opportunity, and I get that, and to an extent, I'm with them on that. But Rob Coig, I would say, didn't cover himself in any glory over the last couple of months. First of all, by very much acting as if he was owner in waiting, before jumping the gun, really, doing things that really are unprecedented for a potential owner rather than a current owner, in terms of being in and amongst the club and having an influence on decisions. Actually, that's, I think, what Ruben Sellers was most concerned about. That here's a guy who hadn't been confirmed as a new owner that was having a direct influence on the way the football club was being run. Now, you can say, well, he lent them £4 million, so he's entitled to do that, but I don't think that'll happen again. I think any new potential owners will be kept at arm's length until the deal's absolutely done. And the long and the short of it is that he was, like any businessman, trying to get himself a really good deal, and the group of people he was putting together, the consortium, didn't quite add up in terms of the number of people and the investment in that. So he didn't meet Dai Junger's requirements in terms of finance, and that's the sad truth. And you can spin it any way you like, but ultimately, and you can say, well, Dai Junger was asking for too much, or he was upping the price as time went on. But as I understand it from several reliable sources, you'd look at it and say, actually, Rob Coig didn't ever really meet what Dai Junger was after here.
And Johnny, over to you now.
Tim, nice to see you again.
Yeah, good to see you. Long time.
Thanks for joining Talking Royals. It was a real pleasure to have you on, and I'm sure you saw, some very the passion of the fans that we care about our club, as you do as a fan as well, which is really good for us to see. Getting back to on the pitch, which kind of is, with all the takeover stuff that's sort of overshadowed that. What do you make of the start to the season for the team, and where do you kind of see them developing? Obviously a bit of a blip last week, but generally it's not been too bad, is it, positive wise? And
yeah, we've got to hope it was a bit of a blip, definitely. And the Charlton game and the Wigan game performances suggested it set quite a high bar, didn't it? It showed us what they've got in the tank, and if they can find any sort of consistency approaching those levels, then we could be in for a really good season. I do think, and this has been said a load of times before, nothing new here, but the depth of the squad worries me. And I thought we maybe got that shown up, actually, most bizarrely, in the goalkeeping position on Saturday last week. We're having to dig quite deep in the squad to find 11 fit and able players. And nothing against Canard Boys Clark, but for me, he's not the one at this stage. I'm sure he will be in the future. I hope he will be in the future. But David Button wasn't fully fit last week. I didn't know that until yesterday when I was talking to Ruben Sellers. This week he is fully fit, so it'll be interesting to see where he goes with that decision at Bolton, and then hopefully Joel Pereira will be back at the end of the month. So that's an example. But all around the pitch, you look at the fullbacks, Kelvin Abrefas on his way back, and Jarell Dorset, young and finding life quite tricky at left back. Michael Craig doing a terrific job at right back, but he's not a specialist right back. He's brilliant player, I think, but probably more comfortable sitting in central midfield. So they're just a few examples of where we're looking a little bit light and flimsy, and that's the only thing that worries me. But at least they've shown that when they hit their straps and they're at full pace and fully charged up, they've definitely got something, and you wouldn't expect them to be close to the top and the bottom, I think, based on what we've seen in the first 5 games.
Definitely. And do you see, I think the effect of Ruben actually having a pre-season with these lads, a proper pre-season, isn't it? And you can see, and physically, some of the players have grown as well in stature, that we're a harder team to compete against. Like Kelvin's really got taller, stronger, muscly. When young men becoming men, really, aren't they now? Like these young lads have been thrown into the fire to because we haven't had any other choice. But something like Tyler Binden's been superb as a young man coming into a team. What do you make of him?
Tyler Binden, I think, is an unbelievably good player. Yeah, I mean, he's so young. He was 19 still, isn't he? And he's absolute quality. Kelvin Ehibatum, and you mentioned, I really like him. I'm not sure Ruben Sellers likes him as much as I do. Actually, I think he's our most dangerous attacking player, but seems to get whipped off the pitch sooner than I'd like. And there are others as well. Michael Craig, I've just mentioned. Charlie Savage, he's only 21. A real youngster who's, I think, doing great things. Apologies to all of those I've left out. There's a real good batch of youngsters coming through. And you mentioned the pre-season. I always think of proper pre-seasons, as you put it, when we go to Thailand or South Korea or at least Slovenia. I'm a bit disappointed that we haven't had any away trips, but that's for obvious reasons. But look, at least he's had a bit of time to work with them and uninterrupted time, whereas last summer, well, before the previous season, he was drafted in at the end of July and had no time to get them properly ready. So, yeah, hopefully we're seeing the effects of his pre-season. I think you have to remember Ruben Sellers is a proper sports scientist. His wife is a dietitian. She's a nutritionist, and he absolutely lives and breathes sports science. And at home, I imagine there's some what you might consider quite dull conversations about biomechanics and physiology and nutrition and diet. The whole, his whole life is that, and he's got great knowledge on that. And what he's best at, I suspect, is preparing young athletes to be elite performers. And I hope that's what we're seeing as signs of now.
And Tim, just want to ask you about Ruben Sellers. Obviously, he was linked inverted commas with Stoke City, aka a rumor, but this emotion that you talked about, how this has affected him, what's your, know him better than Johnny and I do. You speak to him, so you've got to know him. What do you think he's thinking now? Do you think he's the sort of person he's going to stick with this, and this is just another hurdle to overcome, and he's got that resilience? Or do you think he's thinking, I'm not sure about this now?
With all these managers, you say I get to know them, and look, I do know them in as much as I speak to them, and we have very intense one-to-one conversations 3 times a week for 40 weeks of the year. So in that sense, you do get to know the managers really well in my role. But in another sense, it's all very false and bit contrived. And we were talking yesterday actually after we'd turned the microphones off about how he's very calculated, and I was talking to this with him about this, and he was saying he'll never say anything he doesn't intend to, and he always has it in his mind what he wants to put across to us, because he knows that it gets dissected and analysed by people like yourselves, and me. So it's a slightly false relationship in that sense. I remember with Veljko Paunovic during the COVID era, during the pandemic, basically, apart from my wife, he was the person I was speaking to most face to face, because I was allowed to go to games and do interviews with him, but we all were wearing masks, and I wasn't allowed to see him to speak to anybody else, obviously, because we were all, locked up at home. So that was an example where you feel like you know these people really well, but on actually you don't know them as people well at all. You just, it's like a very professional, very superficial relationship. But in terms of Ruben specifically at the moment, and judging from yesterday, and obviously I've been speaking to him regularly for a year, as you say, he was really irate. I mean, I've not seen him like that before. It reached a new level of fury. And it was quite controlled, and he was obviously calculated, but nonetheless, he was at the end of his tether, his wit's end, because partly because of the deal falling through, but partly because of the access that Rob Coig had been permitted within the club during that couple of months when he was lining it up and trying to buy it. And then partly because of the communication from the top. So when I say the top, there's not much of a top now, is there? Because you look around and Mark Bowen's out off the scene, and Dai Yong Pang has never really been around, the chief exec, and Dai Younger obviously is, you wouldn't be expecting to communicate regularly with him, but I think he was very upset that basically he learnt about the deal going wrong and it finally coming to a close by listening to one of my sports bulletins earlier this week, rather than having a direct phone call. I think he got a call from Rob Coig, actually, which is quite unusual, isn't it? You'd expect him to get a call from someone within the club to say the whole thing was off. So I think he was upset about that as well, and the leak, which he's sort of sensible enough to know that's just me doing my job, but
yeah,
I'm not sure he was pleased about it.
And Tim, just want to ask you before I hand back to Johnny about, as a fellow Reading fan, and also in your professional capacity, you're very close to the club, speak to the players, and you've seen plenty of good times at Reading, like we all have. When did you start to think in this process after Sir John, sold the club? When did you start to think, this might be starting to go wrong? When did you get that sense?
That's a great question that no one's asked me, and I was hoping someone would at some point, because I didn't really see the Anton Zingarovic era as a problem. Now you'll say, "What? You're joking, aren't you?" But I was just enjoying the fact they were up in the Premier League. He and Sir John. At that point, it was a 51% ownership from Sir John, 49 from Anton Zingarovic. He left the club in a horrible position because he didn't follow his contract through to buy the rest of the other half of the club from Sir John, and that's what caused that havoc. But actually, publicly, it all looked pretty funky, didn't it? Because we had, let's get Jason Roberts in and let's see how Brian McDermott can go. It was all brilliant from my point of view. Steve Clarke, I thought, did a really good job. We got to an FA Cup semi-final and we looked quite promising in the Championship, and then he went, and I remember Nick Blackman bizarrely leaving, and I thought, I don't like that very much. And steadily with the ties, it was all a bit weird and wacky, but it wasn't a crisis then. Although the ownership, you started to think, well, why have they got the car park? And I'm not sure I like the idea of my car parking space being turned into an ice rink, and various other bits and pieces that looked a bit weird. And then in came 2017. In came the Chinese mob with Ron Gourlay was around. I was a bit uneasy about that, and I think I remember talking. We have that chat. I don't know if you've regularly listened to our show, but with AD and Mick on Saturday afternoon between 2 and 3, it's a bit of a free for all. It's quite unusual radio, in as much as we basically just say what we think and on we go. And it's not very scripted, and it's probably not very professional, but we quite enjoy doing it. And so I remember about 3 or 4 years ago, us having a chat and me saying, I just don't understand how these sums add up. I think we're going to get absolutely clobbered at some point for financial fair play, profitability and sustainability as it is now. Because you looked at the contracts that are being handed out and the players they were bringing in, and the Dave Edwards and Sonny Aluko and all of that crowd, and Mo Barrow, and then they were handing out sort of ridiculous contract extensions. I remember Yaku Mate getting a 3 or 4 year deal just on a random Tuesday afternoon when he was injured, and you thought, well, where is the logic here? How are they finding the money and justifying this? and it didn't add up. And I just thought in a year or two's time, we're going to look at the figures and there's going to be a massive debt. And sure enough, I think was there 1 year, £47 million debt. I mean, but you could see that coming. And that was the point where I got a bit of the EBGBs. And I was thinking, look, it wasn't going very well on the pitch either. So I suppose you could say it was easy to predict by that point. But we were never really looking like challenging to get back up into the Premier League. We had a brief couple of months with Paul Ince and a brief couple of months with Veljko Paunovic, where we towards the beginning end of the season. But it just, in many ways, I'm tempted to trawl back through the archive and find the time on a Saturday afternoon at around about 2:15. It was probably in 2019 or 2020 where I was saying on air, we've got a problem around the corner here. This is going to end badly. But the only reason I'd do that would be so I could say I told you so, and it would take me hours to do. So there's no point in doing that.
All right, Johnny, do you want to jump in and
Yeah,
go on? Sorry.
yeah, no, Serge, just because just a change of topic or area. Tim, after all this time, you still enjoy what you do? You've been through the mill with this
Yeah.
club.
No, look, I still love it, really. I don't know why, because I mean, I'm just about to drive up to Bolton, by the way. I've got, 4 hours in the car to contemplate the meaning of life on the M6. And you have
That's
to love
commitment.
it, don't you? If you're going to do that, you've got to love it. And I really still absolutely love 3 o'clock on a Saturday afternoon. My whole week is shaped around that, and it doesn't matter what else I'm doing. Yeah, I just sort of live for it, really, because my whole life is shaped around those kickoff times, and that's the same as any fan, I suppose. I'm lucky enough to do it for a job, but yeah, because I often, like everybody, you have moments where you think, should I really be still doing this? And I probably should have moved on 15 years ago to do something a bit more mature, maybe. But because I love it, and it's I was born in Reading and I brought up in Reading and I've lived in Reading all my life, and it's a club I've always supported. So you think, well, I'll stick with it. But yeah, it's tougher, and it's an enjoyment in a different way, I suppose. And I won't lie, I prefer it when I go to Old Trafford and Anfield on a Saturday afternoon, and Bolton and Rotherham. But that's it still beats most other ways of earning a living, doesn't it?
Yeah.
What's your highlight you've been for you
Highlight?
for you personally in your journey?
Well, I suppose the one that springs to mind would be Kevin Doyle scoring at Leicester to get Reading up, but then Mikel Edgeworth's goal against Forest to get Reading up again. I thought the FA Cup run, the Bradford game at home, the replay, and then the semi-final against Arsenal in 2015 was amazing. The Liverpool game in the FA Cup, the Brian McDermott win on that incredibly cold January night, that got that whole era up and running, in my view. The Brynjar Gunnarsson nutmeg and the Shane Long goal. There's a start. There's 5 for you. There are loads. I mean, that's the joy of it, isn't it? And sometimes the highlights are sort of less high-profile moments, and sometimes they're sort of the quieter moments. Maybe I should sort of think and answer that question more properly, I suppose, because there have been sort of quieter moments in the bar in Slovenia with Nigel Gibbs and Brian McDermott on a pre-season, and those sorts of moments where you have to pinch yourself and think, wow, this is quite a treat. So,
and Tim, I'm going to finish, because by the time I've got one more question to finish with, because by the time this goes out, we've got our fingers crossed for you that you're not stuck on a motorway heading up to Bolton somewhere. So we better let you go. And
you can listen to himself in the car.
Yeah, that's it. So
that's one thing. It is not a highlight over the last 20 years. I don't like listening.
So look, the final question, and in keeping with the current theme at Reading, the opposite of what Johnny's asked you, just pick one low point. It might be this week, it might be going back to a few years ago. Just pick out a low point, that whatever it is that's really.
I think I'll give you one. It was in the car park at Huddersfield a couple of seasons back, at the end of the season, when Reading had officially been relegated to League One. And I thought, I often do this in away games. I think I'll just have a quick check on social media and see what everyone's saying, because obviously after the game I go and do my player interviews and my manager interviews, and it was a game, if you remember, that Reading weren't actually playing in. So I travelled all the way up to Huddersfield to see what happened against Sheffield United. We were expecting Sheffield United to beat Neil Warnock's Huddersfield, and that would have been enough to keep our hopes alive of staying up. As it was, Sheffield United, I mean, almost literally didn't turn up, and Huddersfield won, and that kept them safe. I really like Neil Warnock, which I know will annoy a load of Reading fans, but I think he's an absolute genius. And so I did my post-match interview with him and did a couple of reports and what have you. I got in the car afterwards and I was trawling through social media, and it's just like, oh, League One is such a long way away from where we want to be. And it's not so much that League One's a disaster or a nightmare, but it's more that you're that much further away from the dream, which has to be for Reading, in my view, playing against Manchester United and Manchester City and Liverpool and all that's the dream, isn't it? If you've been following Reading for the last 20 years, that's what we want to be doing. And if not, then we want to be almost within touching distance of that.
Yeah,
and
we want
when
some,
you're in League One,
real hope.
You're too removed from it, aren't you? It's going to, even if you have an absolute belting couple of seasons, you're still reaching out for it.
Yeah.
Whereas whenever you're in the Championship, it's nearly there, isn't it?
Well, look, I tried to do the good journalism thing of balance, but I think it's really unfair. I don't want to leave on a downer, because you have got that, you've got that downer there, and then you've got this long trip up north. So I want to leave on a positive note. You talked about that time with with spending moments with Brian McDermott and away trips to other countries, that sort of thing. Just give me an insight of, pick out one person within Reading Football Club. It could be a member of staff, a player, manager, coach, whatever, who's kind of inspired you in all the time that you've been a Reading fan, reporting on Reading, covering Reading for BBC Radio Berkshire. Who's stood out for you as an inspiration?
So there's so many people, and I almost feel that's quite a difficult question to answer, because I don't want anyone to feel disappointed that I don't offer them as my person. But I'll go Ron Grant, because the guy, he's so humble, and he was so much about what Reading were. So for younger listeners, it's Ron Grant was the kit man back in the glory days, yeah. And you're going to say, well, the kit man, how much influence can he have over things? I tell you, that man had unbelievable influence over that whole era. And it wasn't because he washed the socks brilliantly. It was because of his personality and character and his relationship with the players around the place. And I would go as far as to say, is Ron Grant's injury, when he had an accident on Boxing Day, we were due to play West Ham on that day, or we did play West Ham on that day, but he got injured and was then not available for the rest of the season. It turned out to be the year that Reading were actually relegated. You're going to say, oh, the guy's lost the plot here, but I honestly think that cost Reading Premiership status, because he was such a big character and so loved in the camp, and he just was the glue that held everything together. And with him not being there for the next 3 or 4 months, and the form went, literally on the day that Ron fell over, it was like the form fell over as well. And everyone goes, oh, that's just a coincidence. He's only the kit man. No, he was such a big part of that whole time, and the feel good factor. And it wasn't a coincidence, and so I found him utterly inspirational. He did it in such a humble way, and he probably did it without realizing. It was just his character and his nature. But so I will have him as and you could easily say Sir John or Steve Coppell or Brian McDermott or Nigel Gibbs or any of the physios I've always thought have been brilliant at Reading, or any number of people. But if you're asking me to give you one name, I'll go there.
Well, Tim, thanks ever so much for your time. I wanted to end it on a bit of a positive note there, and set you up on a more positive note for your long trip up north.
Yeah.
So good luck with that. We'll keep our fingers crossed that that's at least smoother on your way up there than things at Reading FC at the moment. But Tim, really appreciate you coming on. Thanks very much for your time.
Thanks, Mark. Cheers, Johnny.
Cheers, nice to see you.